Assalamu alaikum, this is Dr. Hasna with Hasna's Anatomy, and today we're discussing the vessels of the orbit, and in that most importantly included is the ophthalmic artery, plus we're going to discuss the superior and inferior ophthalmic veins. Alright, so let's get started. Do not forget to subscribe to my channel. We're going to talk about the ophthalmic artery, which is a branch of the internal carotid artery. So I want you to remember, whenever you study any kind of artery, vein or nerve, the courses that you learn should always be done in the form of bullet points for ease. These are some tips that I'm giving you that you will remember, and they will always be helpful for you. Learn them in points so it becomes easy, and make those points short for yourself so you remember well only of the main parts of the courses, like the most important events of the course. All right, so let's get started. Let me just give you an orientation. Basically what happens is your internal carotid artery comes and is on the roof of the cavernous sinus, right about over here, and this is where your internal carotid artery gives off the ophthalmic artery, and the name says it, that is going to go into the orbit to supply the eye, right? So this cerebral part of the internal carotid artery is the origin of the ophthalmic artery, and once it originates, it enters this optic canal right over here. We've studied the optic canal. It goes inside this place, accompanied with the optic nerve to enter what? The orbit. You remember the optic canal was lying in the orbit. Firstly, always number one, the first point I'm going to talk about the ophthalmic artery is its origin. I hope you understood, is that it's from the internal carotid artery. Once it originates, it enters through the optic canal accompanied by the optic nerve. Optic canal, which lies medial to the anterior clinoid process. This is the optic canal, lies medial to the anterior clinoid process. So you can just add these extra points if you want, if you like. But for the ease of learning, even remembering these bullet points is enough. Always remember, in anatomy, we need to know the relations of everything. So it does lie with the optic nerve, but where does it lie? So if the optic nerve is lying above, the ophthalmic artery lies infrolateral. So if this is the lateral and this is the medial, it lies infro, meaning below it, and lateral to it, infrolaterally. All right, and then these two are enclosed in a single dura mater sheath. That means your optic nerve, we all know it originates from the brain, so obviously it carries some dura with it. So the ophthalmic artery and the optic nerve are both encased in the same dural sheath. All right, so that is also a very important point. Now what happens is, suppose the orbit is right here. All right, once the ophthalmic artery, it enters the orbit, what it does is it pierces the dural sheath, that is it is encased in with the optic nerve, and what it does, it ascends. Suppose this is the optic nerve, this, my finger, is the ophthalmic artery. When it enters the orbit, what it does, it ascends. So you can see it is ascending and it's remaining lateral to it, right? So it ascends first, and then what it does, once it comes above the nerve, it turns medially and goes towards medial wall of the orbit until it terminates, and when it terminates as the supratrochlear and the dorsal nasal branches. All right, so always remember the courses of any vessel or nerve or any structure in the form of bullet points. That'll be very easy for you. So it all begins with the origin. So what was the origin? It originated from the internal carotid artery, cerebral part of it, medial to the clinoid process, anterior clinoid process. It penetrated the optic canal, accompanied by the second optic nerve. They were lying the same dural sheath. What did happen in the orbit? It pierced the dural sheath that was in, then it ascended laterally. When it lied above the optic nerve, it turned medially, medial wall of the orbit, and finally at the medial angle of the eye is reached, it terminated by becoming the supratrochlear and dorsal nasal branches. So always remember that your first and your last point should always be about the origin and the termination. Now we're going to look into the branches of it. So here I've drawn a zoomed in version of your orbit so that we can study more properly the branches of the ophthalmic artery. First branch I want you to remember is the CAR, which is most important. This is the central artery of the retina. Every branch I want you to learn a little bit of their courses and their supplies. So central artery of retina, what it does is it lies below the optic nerve. It originates, the first branch and the most important branch of the ophthalmic artery, and it originates early on, and it's like the first branch to originate, and once it originates, it lies below the optic nerve, and then what it does, it pierces the individual dura of the optic nerve. So optic nerve itself also is enclosed in its own dura. Once it pierces the optic nerve's dura, it lies below it, and finally it completely pierces the optic nerve and lies within the substance of the optic nerve. And then this is the area of the eyeball, which is known as the optic disc. And it reaches the optic disc, and this is basically your retina area. This entire area of the eyeball, inside within it is the retina. We'll learn it in the eyeball. And once it reaches the optic disc, what it does is it divides into branches, and it goes ahead and supplies all the layers of the retina that exist of the retina. So important about this is because the retina is the chief organ for your vision. So what happens is, since the central artery of retina is an end artery, basically means any artery that is ending. There is no anastomosis or no bypass route connected with the artery. Therefore, if any damage occurs to this central artery of retina, there is no anastomosis to save it. Therefore, it will result in blindness, complete blindness. Now what happens is, as ophthalmic artery pierces your dural sheath in the orbit, right? The first branch that arises when it is lateral, in the lateral side, the first branch that arises is known as the lacrimal artery. All right, lacrimal artery is a very large branch, and from the lacrimal artery, further arteries will arise. And after that, the ophthalmic artery obviously turns medially. So now we're talking about the lacrimal artery. The first branch, obviously, it gives to the the lacrimal gland is kept over here in the lateral part. So it gives branches to the lacrimal gland. These are the first branches it gives. It gives two zygomatic branches, because we all know the zygomatic bone lies laterally. It gives two zygomatic branches, one which runs in the zygomaticofacial foramen, one in the zygomaticotemporal foramen. After that, it gives the lateral palpebral branches. Palpebral means eyelids. So these branches supply eyelid from lateral side. And then it gives the recurrent meningeal branch. The recurrent meningeal branch, it goes back into the cranial cavity and anastomosis vessels inside, right? So this is a recurrent meningeal branch. Finally, it gives your muscular branches to the muscles of the orbit. Obviously, the muscles that we talked about in my previous video. So these are the branches of the lacrimal artery, which is going towards the running in the lateral wall of the orbit. Now we're going to talk about the medial wall of the orbit, the ophthalmic artery itself, the main trunk. What branches arise from that? First, I want you to remember these are the supras. The two supras arise from this part, the supraorbital and the supratrochlear. Now we know that the supratrochlear is what it terminates as. Okay, makes sense. And one more it gives is the supraorbital. Just remember that in addition to that. Then it gives two anterior and posteriors. These are the ethmoidal arteries. These two arteries are chiefly going to supply the ethmoidal air sinuses. So these arise from about over here, all right? The next branches are the posterior ciliary arteries. Now, these are the chief arteries which supply your choroid and iris. Now, these are parts of the eyeball. You don't need to know them right now. We'll talk about in the eyeball what these structures actually are. Posterior ciliary arteries are also of two types. These are one is the long posterior ciliary artery, and then there are short ciliary arteries. These are just going to supply the choroid layer and the iris in the front. All right. Now, what's important is that the muscular branches of your lacrimal artery, these give a branch known as the opposite of this branch, known as the anterior ciliary artery. So the long posterior ciliary artery will anastomose with that. All right, and they both have to supply the similar areas. And finally, we have the medial palpebral, because lateral palpebral are already given, so someone has to supply the medial part of the eyelid. So obviously medial palpebral. And the dorsal nasal branches, do not forget these. We've already discussed that this is the termination of the ophthalmic artery. So this is also included, the dorsal nasal branches. These will basically supply your upper part of the nose. So these are overall all the branches you needed to know of the ophthalmic artery. Let me go through a revision because that is important. The most important branch that I talked about was the central artery of retina. It supplied the retina. It was an end artery. All right. So don't forget that it can lead to blindness if any damage occurs. Next, the ophthalmic artery gave a lateral branch called the lacrimal artery. This gave further branches for the lacrimal gland, some muscular branches for the orbit, recurrent meningeal that goes back into the cranial cavity, lateral palpebral branches for the lateral part of eyelid, and then two zygomatic branches. Then we went ahead and we talked about the main trunk that was turning medially. From this main trunk, what are the branches that arise? The first, importantly, there are the supras, the two supraorbital and supratrochlear. With the supratrochlear, it terminated along with the dorsal nasal. And then we had the anterior and posterior ethmoidal branches. We had the posterior ciliary, one was long, two were short. The long is to most with the anterior ciliary branch. And finally, we had the medial palpebral branches. So guys, that's all you need to know about the ophthalmic artery. Now let me just go through a little bit of the superior and inferior ophthalmic veins. Obviously, we're talking about the vessels of the orbit. So the only important part about these are exactly going to have like tributaries that are similar named as the branches of the ophthalmic artery. Just the difference is this lies superior and this lies inferior to the optic nerve. Otherwise, they are accompanying the ophthalmic artery all along, and they just have to go ahead and drain into the cavernous sinus. So with that, I'll end the video. I really hope you understood today's lecture. For more conceptual anatomy videos, do not forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching.